Following the successful invasion of Italy in September 1943, the Allied advance had ground to a halt due to poor weather, rough terrain, and stiffening resistance. As a result, Allied planners were looking for a way to break out of the costly struggle that was consuming enormous numbers of men and scarce supplies. In early November, Lieutenant General Mark Clark was directed to formulate a plan for landing a single division at Anzio, a site that was within striking distance of Rome, but still in reach of Allied aircraft operating from Naples. The target date was late December, but the subsequent lack of progress and a chronic shortage of troops and shipping due to the ongoing buildup for the Overlord operation made the initial landing date impractical. It wasn't until January 22, 1944, that troops of the Fifth Army swarmed ashore on a 15-mile stretch of Italian beach near the towns of Anzio and Nettuno.
The landing at Anzio was, at least in our sector, was fairly uneventful. I think we totally took the Germans by surprise on that landing. But once we were on the beach, then we just moved inland as fast as we could.
The Anzio operation is almost Salerno on a larger scale. You have, first of all, an apparent confusion in what is our purpose, in that the fellow on the spot says, essentially, all we got to do is get ashore and dig in, while somebody else is saying you get ashore and you head for Rome, while the forces that get ashore don't have the mobility to go for Rome, while the beachhead you are trying to consolidate is tactically horrible.
The hills completely surrounded the area, probably about 10 miles back. And beyond the hills was the main road from Rome to down through Pascasino, which was, of course, to be our first objective, was to cut that road. We never got there.
I'm not entirely certain that Lucas's decision to sit there and consolidate the beachhead at Anzio, and it's a very criticized decision, wasn't the right decision under the circumstances. Had he gone to Rome instead of consolidating the beachhead, would the beachhead have survived? Because again, the Germans were able to put together a pretty potent counterattack force.
We were surrounded by about 10 divisions, and they held all the high ground. There were a lot of casualties, mostly by mortars and by artillery.
There was a lot of fire coming in from the hills, and during the time that the division spent at Anzio, a 380 millimeter cannon was set up about 20 miles or so back into the hills, firing on us, and they would, it was a railroad gun, so they would fire 2 or 3 shells, whatever they figured they could without being detected, then roll the gun back into a tunnel. And so our aircraft were never able to locate them.
I think it was a mistake to go in Anzio. We did not accomplish anything, not a thing. To me, it was Churchill's folly, I think, because he's the one that said we should go in and relieve the pressure up there, and I don't see how we did.
Churchill said, I had hoped to fling a wildcat upon the beach, and all I got was a stranded whale. And that type of thing. But Churchill didn't give us enough landing craft, enough ships to even supply the campaign, so that was why it failed. And we sat there all winter.
Anzio failed to break the stalemate in Italy and thus became a source of ongoing angst for the Allies. Over the next 4 months, the Italian campaign would see some of the most savage fighting of World War II. Fortunately, there was some good news in the early months of 1944, thanks to the efforts of the Allied air forces and their massive campaign against the Luftwaffe. The American 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command, bolstered by the arrival of several long-range fighter groups, undertook a massive effort to destroy the Luftwaffe and its production facilities. Culminating in February with what became known as Big Week, the campaign essentially broke the back of the Luftwaffe's daylight fighter force. Big Week kicked off with an 800-plane RAF raid against Leipzig, which did extensive damage to the town, though 78 bombers failed to return. Subsequent raids by the 8th and later the Italy-based U.S. 15th Air Force struck at fighter manufacturing plants at Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Rostock. In just 6 days, the U.S. Army Air Force managed to put up over 7,400 sorties.
Fortunately, we had the Mustang coming along, and the Mustang had enough range that it could go out, and you could use new tactics and lure the Luftwaffe in the air using the bombers for bait. Instead of flying close formation, they'd go out and reach out, get the German fighters as they were assembling, and prevent them from ever attacking the bombers.
What these large raids do is draw the Luftwaffe up into an all-out, full-scale battle over the Reich. And the Luftwaffe loses. The fighter force is decimated. And in the months before D-Day, the great contribution that these raids made was not necessarily destroying German production capacity, but capturing command of the air. Without air superiority, there would have been no D-Day.
At the beginning of March, the 8th Air Force really poured it on as tremendous numbers of heavy bombers were sent against Berlin in broad daylight. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts swarmed to the attack, only to fall like rain before the Mustangs and veteran Thunderbolt pilots.
2 of us attacked 75 109s and shot 3 of them down and damaged about 3 or 4 more. Now, we weren't stupid. We attacked from the rear, attacked onto the back of them, and disrupted their formation and broke off their proposed attack on the bombers.
He went into the clouds, so I pulled back up because I knew I'd overrun him. And sure enough, there he come out of the clouds, and I went back down on him again and got on him and hit him right in the right wing, and he started smoking and went on crashed into the trees.
As the Allied bombing effort ramped up over Germany, the troops back in England continued to prepare for D-Day. In the British Army, Montgomery looked over the divisions that had stayed in England throughout the war and was concerned with what he saw.
The troops that Montgomery had to command in England had either seen no action during the war or had seen their last action in the disaster of 1940. They had been well trained, but he had concerns with their lack of experience and insisted that some veterans of the Desert Campaign and Italy be brought in from the Mediterranean and used as assault units in the actual invasion. This was not greeted as really good news by those troops who felt they had done their bit and then some and would once again be thrown into the fire.
For the Americans, inexperience was the order of the day. Though the U.S. Army had been fighting the Germans since Operation Torch, the vast majority of the units earmarked for D-Day had recently been raised and trained in stateside bases. Inexperienced leaders blended with inexperienced men trained to fight in open, mobile warfare where speed and improvisation were the keys to victory. Those assets the Americans possessed in spades, but it would not be the type of warfare they would encounter in Normandy.
The training regimen was so intense that it's hard to say units could ever be more ready. Now, clearly, there's something different about being ready and being experienced in combat.
To give the American First Army a corps of veterans, several units from the Mediterranean were redeployed, including the 1st and 9th Infantry Divisions, the 82nd Airborne, and the 2nd Armored. The 1st, known as the Big Red One, had already seen action in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. To lead First Army, Ike selected Omar Bradley, a modest, self-effacing infantry officer who had served under Patton in the Mediterranean campaigns. Bradley had 4 corps commanders under him, but only one had ever taken part in an amphibious operation.
This was General Corlett, who had plenty of experience over in the Pacific with the 7th Infantry Division, where he undertook amphibious operations in the Aleutians and then in the Central Pacific campaign at Kwajalein. Well, one of the things that he had learned there in the Central Pacific especially was that they always underestimated the amount of artillery ammunition they would need for supporting the beachhead once the troops were ashore. So that was one of the first things he suggested to the planners at SHAEF. And he also suggested the use of amphibious tractors, which they found to be very useful in the Central Pacific. He was essentially ignored by the American planners because they felt that the Pacific was nothing more than a bush league. He found a more receptive audience in the British, and the British actually did listen to several of his lectures and extract some useful lessons that they then applied to their own beaches in the D-Day operation.
In spite of American perceptions regarding the rigid way in which Britain was approaching Overlord, it was in fact the British who were more likely to explore unusual and even bizarre methods for solving a problem. All over the British Isles, experiments were conducted with a variety of gadgets that had been developed to combat the German war machine. Some worked, and of course, some didn't. But every effort was made to ensure that the troops slated for invasion would have the best possible chance of success, for beyond the Channel stood Hitler's Atlantic Wall. After expelling Allied armies from continental Europe in 1940, Hitler set his sights on the invasion and capture of England. The Luftwaffe filled Britain's skies in preparation for the invasion, but despite being outgunned and outnumbered, the Royal Air Force defeated the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Germany's plan, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, was put on hold. Almost immediately, the realization that it was only a matter of time before the Allies would try to return to the continent began to gnaw at the German High Command. With nearly 2,000 miles of coastline to defend, the Atlantic coast had to be made invasion-proof. Toward that end, thousands of men had labored to forge the Atlantic Wall, an imposing barricade of concrete obstacles, pillboxes, and heavy guns. The Canadians had been savaged on the beaches of Dieppe in the summer of 1942, and the memory of that experience weighed heavily on the minds of the planners of Overlord. But by early 1944, the Atlantic Wall was built more on reputation than fact. The truth was, defensive emplacements did not exist in the strength and number needed to repel a concerted Allied assault. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel made this abundantly clear after he inspected the Atlantic Wall's defenses in early 1944. His report to Hitler convinced the Fuhrer to give Rommel command of Army Group B, the most important command in France. Rommel took over in March and immediately went to work. Engineering battalions, combat troops, and slave laborers turned beach approaches into a nightmare of concrete dragon's teeth, submerged obstacles, hedgehogs, mines, and spikes. Artillery positions were roofed and walled with concrete and laced together with miles of barbed wire. Thousands of new tank traps, obstacles, and pillboxes were added to the wall, and by the end of May, millions of mines had been buried along the French coast. Elsewhere, poles were planted to guard against glider landings, and fields were flooded to discourage airborne assault. It was a massive effort, but it came at a cost.
Every ton of steel that went into the beach obstacles, that went into the reinforced concrete of the Atlantic Wall, that's a ton of steel that wasn't there to be turned into artillery ammunition.
After Field Marshal Rommel's arrival in Normandy, he put the soldiers of the static divisions to work very quickly to make Normandy a less hospitable landing area. However, his use of his static divisions to do this manual labor had an effect on their readiness, so that by the time that the invasion does come, you find that they operate tactically in the field in a less than optimal way.
As preparations forged ahead on both sides of the Channel, the Germans formed numerous divisions and battalions and sent them to defend portions of the Atlantic Wall. A massive reserve, composed mainly of Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, began to coalesce, and Panzer units were redeployed from the Eastern Front to the West.
In 1943-44, Germans were short on manpower, and much of the manpower from the divisions had to come from the east.
Much of the Atlantic Wall was manned by units that were called static divisions. These were the lowest quality units the German army had. Some of their troops were German, and some of them had been raised in Poland or Czechoslovakia, and there were certain units, the so-called Ost battalions, that were raised primarily from prisoners of war taken from the Soviet army and offered the simple deal. You can stay in a prisoner of war camp and starve to death, or you can join the German army. Many obviously chose to join the German army. These troops were not completely reliable, and in combat, while a few of them would fight hard, most of them would surrender at the first opportunity.
Their equipment was showing that this was really being done on the shoestring compared to the Western forces. Vast amounts of captured equipment, limited ammunition, and they had to adapt the defensive tactics to reflect this.
By the late spring of 1944, the Germans had 4 armies in France. The 7th covered the Normandy region, while the 19th and the 1st were deployed in southern France. The 15th, and by far the strongest, defended the Pas de Calais. Altogether, the 4 armies could depend on a panzer reserve of over 10 divisions. Rommel was convinced that a successful enemy landing meant that the war was lost. Determined to stop the Allies on the beaches, he shunned a defense-in-depth strategy for power at the point of attack. The panzer divisions were the key to Rommel's defense, for they alone had the power to destroy an Allied landing. The battle he envisioned started with British and Americans coming ashore in the face of blistering fire from the fortifications overlooking the beaches. Trapped at the water's edge, resupply efforts hampered by anti-landing boat obstacles, the enemy would be pinned in place until a swift panzer counterattack destroyed their lodgment. To carry out this plan effectively, the panzer divisions in France had to be close to the beaches most likely to be hit. Rommel wanted to redeploy them in this fashion, but his immediate superior, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, refused to allow it.
Field Marshal von Rundstedt proposes the use of the German Armored Reserve in a more centralized location farther back so that it can be as easily dispatched to any of the threatened fronts. Field Marshal Rommel, on the other hand, wants to immediately strike the Allies at the water's edge, feels that those reserves need to be farther forward. Ultimately, this conflict will have to be resolved by Adolf Hitler, who, in one of his rare compromises, will kind of try to satisfy both.
Another area of strategic concern for the Germans was precisely where to focus their efforts. Possibilities abounded. Although western France was the most likely site, the Allied blow could conceivably fall in Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, or even the Balkans. Eventually, the German High Command settled on the Pas de Calais and shifted increasing resources to the 15th Army stationed there. Just why the Germans settled on Calais stems from one of the greatest deception operations in military history.
To ensure the success of Overlord, Allied planners realized they needed to do 2 things. They needed to deceive the Germans as to the initial landing point, and they needed to convince the Germans that once the Allied troops were ashore in Normandy, that this was just a secondary operation and the main hammer blow was yet to come. To do this, they established a variety of very tricky deception operations, the most important of which was known as Operation Fortitude South.
Fortitude South sought to convince the Germans that the Allied assault would occur at the Pas de Calais, just 20 miles from England, but 150 miles east of the true invasion site at Normandy. To perpetuate the deception, the Allies went to great pains to feed the Germans bogus information from double agents.
The Germans had a network of spies inside England during the war, all of them sending by radio various messages back to Germany. What the Germans didn't know was that all of them had been caught by British intelligence. They had then been offered a simple deal. Look, you're a spy, okay? And what happens to spies is you get shot. So you can be shot or you can work for us. Would you like to do that? And funny thing, all of them decided, yes, we'd like to do that very much. The British then fed them with intelligence, some of it real, some of it false, which they then broadcast back to Germany by radio. Enough real, solid information was sent to build up the credibility of these agents so the Germans would believe they were the real thing.
Through the double agent network, the Allies fed the Germans a complete order of battle for the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, which included both actual and phantom divisions. While the 4th British, the 1st Canadian, and the 3rd U.S. armies were indeed present in England, the 14th U.S., which included 30 divisions, existed almost entirely on paper. General George Patton, a foe the Germans had come to respect in North Africa, was placed in overall command of FUSAG. Reports of increased troop movements, sightings of new divisional patches, and the construction of new bases near Dover, all bodyguard fabrications, soon flooded German intelligence.
In addition to false radio traffic, an incredible amount of false radio traffic, in fact, there were also inflatable canvas shells that could be blown up that looked like a Sherman medium tank or an inflatable truck. German photo reconnaissance aircraft flew over the area on a regular basis and photographed fields full of dummy tanks so that it looked to the Germans that we had strength where we actually